Good day to you. You know, all of you are students at ESU, and most of your association with you is probably in the context of a student. But you know, there are other people affected by ESU as well, like the neighbors of ESU, people who have yards that students pass by, contributing youthful energy as they walk to class, and also sometimes the bad side, which would be litter or noise. And then there is the town borough. The borough of East Stroudsburg, which has to approve plans for East Stroudsburg University every time East Stroudsburg University wants to make a change to its geography by building a building or expanding. And then there is the Route 80 corridor, where you have so many people who are passing through our town because they need to get off at the exit and go to the bathroom, or they're coming to stay here during the weekend, or they're returning to their homes from commuting. So those are just three different sets of people surrounding the university, and it introduces why we are talking about our subject today, which is public relations. Because in the case of all institutions, and sometimes individual people as well, you have to have your public relations in order. You have to have your relations with the public in order. And in fact, there are more than one public for most organizations. We call them publics. So the East Stroudsburg University community is one public, so is students, so are parents, so are commuters. And that's what we're taking on today. We're taking on public relations. Unfortunately, public relations does have a kind of pejorative perspective, if you know what I mean. People looking down on it in some ways. PR, for example, the way that that's said in its tone indicates that some people may think of it as a bogus kind of enterprise where it's just really just dressing up something that is really not very pleasant to people, to society, to the earth, etc. So public relations has that side of it. And yet public relations can be responsible for some major achievements that do advance social good. Public relations health initiatives, for example, whether you agree with them or not, vaccines have saved many, many people. And that's a result in some way, the success thereof, of people being exposed to public relations, convincing them that it's the right thing to do. And I'm not just talking about COVID vaccines here. And so public relations has a lot of potential if it's practiced as we consider in our department ethically. And so in our department, the Department of Communication, we have a public relations concentration where we train our students in the ethical practice of public relations. And I invite you to check it out on our website. So at this term public, I want to define before we go into the history of PR by making sure that we know that in the field of public relations, that term is normally split down the middle into two different types of publics. You've got your internal publics, and those are publics that belong to the organization, right? You're a student at ESU right now, but in some years you'll be graduated and you'll be out there and you won't be affiliated with ESU anymore, except for that's where you have your degree from and you're alumnus. But right now you're internal to ESU. You're part of the internal public. And then there are external publics. You've probably already figured that out. People external to the organization, the neighbors, the businesses around ESU, etc. Now let's go on to talking about the origins of PR. And really there's a loose definition that's applied to PR. Some people consider really anything. You walk out your door with your hair combed, you're doing public relations, right? But you can define it for yourself as we go through here, because what I'm about to introduce is the original public relations, so to speak, was during the American Revolution. The American Revolution with Thomas Paine's Common Sense. That was a publication that he was putting out to try and gain support for breaking away from the English crown, the British crown, breaking away from the Queen, the King. So that was public relations, trying to convince the colonies to make the case, because some colonies say, I'm happy with the arrangement here. That's my motherland. I have my family back in England. So public relations played a role in the revolution. Again, you can decide whether that's true public relations or not. But public relations, as it is most commonly thought of, basically comes out of the Industrial Revolution. Comes out of the Industrial Revolution, public relations, because as companies grew, right, we go from the general store in a town, or a farm that sells eggs, or a person who repairs shoes. We go from those kinds of businesses to corporations when we get industrialization, with the manufacturing of goods at a very fast pace and at a great volume. And so we start to get huge companies growing up, corporations, and they wanted, as their bureaucracies grew, to manage their images. They wanted to make sure, especially railroads and other businesses that could have a bad reputation because of problems that were happening to employees, they want to make sure their images or managed. One of the earliest uses of public relations was what we can consider to be an unethical practice by today's standards is by a name you probably know, P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum, the P.T. Barnum circus. So he would go around with his circus, and before he would arrive at a town or a city where their next destination was, is he would write letters to the editor complaining that the circus was a fraud. And of course, what was the effect of that? It's like saying, don't go in the cookie jar. People flock to the circus. Just what's the harm? Let's go see if it's a fraud. And so he increased the sales by that shady communication practice. Early public relations was what we consider to be one-way communication, or as it was called by a slogan then, press agentry. Press agentry, one-way communication, same thing. It's about communication flowing mostly from the organization to the public. Very little feedback from the public, very little involvement of the public in future plans. You'll go in one direction. That's what press agency is about. And press agentry and public relations in general was really more about building up and managing an image than anything else. It was not really about understanding people. It's just building up and managing an image. Standard Oil, another Pennsylvania-related historical entry into our class, Intro to Mass Media. Standard Oil, founded outside of Erie by John Rockefeller. Today it's Chevron. Standard Oil used to use press releases that were sent out to the news media, hoping that they would be adopted as news stories. And in fact, what are they? They're really advertisements, right? So Standard Oil is one of the first multi-million-dollar corporations starting that kind of practice. The beginnings of image management, though, were really undertaken by railroads, the railroads in the United States, and later utility companies. AT&T is one of them, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, electrical companies, gas companies, etc. They were using public relations, and in fact, more shady practices were going on. A lot of reporters were bribed by railroads so that they wouldn't criticize railroad monopolies and say, hey, if you want to buy a ticket going from Philadelphia to New York, you got one choice and you have to pay the price. We kind of have that today because we just have Amtrak, but prices are controlled, right? That's a government-sponsored or government-run train line. But these companies were private, and they did have monopolies, and it was the only way to travel, right? A big deal. No car on the scene early on, and it's certainly better than riding on a horse, so the railroads were the thing. And you had some practices there that were just taking money from people without competition. The Illinois Central Railroad funded university research on railroads, the Illinois Central Railroad, and the findings which were presented in the press. So it was starting to use the press as an automatic vehicle for news, and that news could be shaped by the railroads. Very, very crafty, right? Ivy Lee is the first person we want to highlight today, followed by Edward Bernays. I'm introducing their names together. I'll come to them shortly. They are known as the co-founders of the field of public relations. So now we're moving away from the malpractice, if you want to consider that, of public relations over to an ethical practice. And we have two people leading the way. First is Ivy Lee. That's his name, like the plant, Ivy Lee, L-E-E. And basically he took two academic fields. Yeah, he took economics and he took psychology and merged them together, economics and psychology. And he assumed that the public would react in public relations. They would react more to symbols and phrases than rational arguments. Symbols and phrases. So you can try and get a person to quit smoking in public relations. It causes cancer. It's going to reduce your respiratory abilities. Your skin is going to not be moisturized. You can say all these rational reasons, or you can say something like, hey, it's no longer cool to smoke. Right? It's a totally different approach, and it's based on Ivy Lee's. People respond better to imagery, like when you see a Nike symbol, you respond better to imagery than responding to rational arguments. Ivy Lee also said it was important to put a human face on corporations. Don't just have Exxon out there. That's kind of what we have today. Can you put a face on Exxon? Where's the person, right? Now, if there's a crisis, you better believe it. There would be a person who came out who would be a spokesman, and that would be the face of the company, right? But Ivy Lee said companies should not be these amorphous, if you know that word, organizations, that basically are a blank, and you don't really know what's by their institutions. They're aloof from human beings. That's what Ivy Lee was saying. Shouldn't be the perception of the public. public. Ivy Lee also was the first to deal with crisis management when things go wrong, to deal with how do you deal with that in public relations. And he has a whole set of tenets that we're going to revisit later on in the class of what you should do if you're in a public relations crisis, like an airline crashing or a medication that accidentally causes death. Ivy Lee also said, and this is key, and the railroads were quite shocked to find out the results, that you don't hide railroad accidents. Don't hide them. Don't hide them. Invite the reporters to accompany you and witness accidents. Now, why is that? Because the reporters will naturally befriend, or at least have an amicable relationship with the crews and see what they go through. And those are real people too, right? So there would be more sympathy. That was the thinking. Kind of, quasi-ethical, that idea, right? As is this one. Ivy Lee also said, you should always tell the truth in public relations. Tell the truth, like the sheriff for Texas did the other day when he said, wrong decision not to go into that classroom. Tell the truth, but Ivy said not so much because it's right. He said it's because it's more effective. And he said, tell the truth sooner rather than later because people will find out about it anyway. Now let's go on to Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the world-famous and historical psychologist. And he was the first, Edward Bernays, to apply social scientific research techniques. Now that may not mean a whole lot to you. It's basically public opinion polling, right? Like all the polling that's coming out right now about what people think about guns and what we see when it comes to an election, and what we see about the president of the United States favorability ratings. All of that is growing out of this social sciences, gathering opinions, counting them up, presenting where the significant opinions are with a margin of error, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he used the term, Edward Bernays, engineering, replace that, engineering consent. Engineering consent. Isn't that interesting that bringing people together really requires like a quasi-technical, mechanical, engineering background to do that? And it's all about the following things: delivering news from credible sources or admired sources, right? And they did that during the pandemic, trying to get people to take the vaccine. They rolled out 4 former presidents as a public service announcement of the United States to try and convince people to take the vaccine. So that's the theory behind that. Secondly, he said, and again, quasi-ethical, you manipulate people without knowing it, right? You can get a woman to start smoking, as many ad campaigns did, by linking smoking with freedom from domestic chores. And that was done for many years to get women, and that's manipulating, right? Getting them to think, oh yeah, so this imagery goes along with being free from all these past stereotypes women had to live according to. And also that there should be two-way interaction between individuals and organizations. Two-way, not press agentry, that one-way kind, but two-way. The internet's going to help with that later on. In essence, Edward Bernays promoted PR as a profession. And that's why in our department, we belong to a national organization with our concentration in public relations. It's called the Public Relations Student Society of America. If you're interested, Professor Jem Zaitanolu or Professor Margaret Mullen, they are both teaching very much in this field, and they are advisors to the PRSSA. This is an organization demonstrating that it's a profession now. It's a professional practice. There are standards, there are ethics that they adhere to. And in essence, this practice believes that the best way to influence people is to have messages that make sense and are delivered by credible sources. That's the essence of public relations right there. Let's talk about some uses of public relations in some unusual areas. We've got World War I. World War I, where the federal government used public relations to try and get the public to accept the fact that we should be involved in World War I, the United States. And a whole body was founded, a government body called the CPI, or Committee on Public Information, to build support for the war, producing television commercials, producing cartoons, producing posters. So this was a major period of growth for PR. It really took off once the government got behind it. And specifically, the strategy for most of these efforts was to get into opinion leadership, that is to find the people who others trust and get to those people, convince them, and then those people start to convince others, your teachers, your actors, your business people. And that led actually to the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson at the time. He held the very first press conference as a result. And we still have press conferences today for presidents. Not all of them do them. Not all of them do them regularly, but it's seen as a necessary feature of getting information out to the public. Now let's move to the business of public relations because we have a whole industry that's grown up, PR, and many of those firms are located in New York City, but we also have some around Allentown and Bethlehem. Our students serve internships with them. It starts with understanding the functions of PR today. There's really three of them. One is informing people, another is persuading people, but then a third one is integrating. You may not know about that one. And that one is where you bring publics and institutions together through shared goals. Bring publics and institutions through shared goals. Again, I come back to East Stroudsburg University. President Marcia Welsh, she's no longer president, she started a program where ESU would go out into the community with a few people working at the university and knock on doors and say, hey, anything you want to mention about the university while we're here? Some would say, yeah, I love those students. I love seeing those students. Others would say, well, they're a little bit noisy on the weekends and so on and so forth. That's bringing people together under the same shared goal, right, which is having a neighborhood that you want to spend time in and you don't want to be annoyed at, whether you're living there or walking through it. That's what integrating is all about. And Bernays, he says the only way you can really do this is if you have two-way communication. You've got to have two-way communication between institutions and publics. Now let's talk about the PR process. What does it involve? If you're a PR firm, it involves 5 different areas. You've got research. So you got to research problems or issues that an organization is facing. If you're a company that wants to have a better view held of it and you're a fracking company, you go into natural rock formations and you bring out gas using a liquid technique that people are, some of which are opposed to, many of which I should say actually, then you want to have your PR well researched, right? You got to know chemicals, you got to know sales, you got to know the environment. So research is a big factor in public relations. And secondly, you got to have objectives. Objectives is where you say, this is what we want to accomplish. We want to raise public opinion. We want to get people to adopt a new behavior. We want to get our company to stock to rise higher. This, you got to have specific objectives. And then third, there's programming, and that's what you do to achieve those objectives. What are you going to do to get to higher stock prices? What are you going to do to have a better perception of the public about a gas company that had an oil spill? What are you going to? You're going to use flyers, you're going to use email, you're going to get social media, you're going to get into the news media cycle, you're going to do a charity program. What are you going to do? There's a lot of different choices there, right? But then comes evaluation so that you know how well you did, because you don't really know unless you evaluate yourself, and that's actually how you improve anyhow. So you got to test messages before you send them out. You got to monitor those messages, and then you got to measure the results against the barometer, right? Like you measure yourself every time you take a class, right? A, B, C, D, F. You're measuring yourself against your results. And then finally, there's stewardship. Stewardship is maintaining relationships that are created through the previous steps. You can't just assume that those relations with the neighbors, because you did one trip 1 year, are going to keep going and keep going well. You have to renew them, not necessarily with the same thing. Maybe it's a block party the next year. I don't know, but you got to keep things going under stewardship. Now let's address crisis communication. As I mentioned earlier, nothing tests an organization like a PR crisis, like that sheriff's department is going through in Texas, or anytime there's some kind of accident that's involving public transportation where people are killed. Public relations, and that's the downside, it unfortunately usually involves those kinds of incidents. So here's what Ivy Lee has laid out for us. He says you got to be prepared. You got to have a crisis plan beforehand. Do you think that every single airline has a plan in case one of their planes goes down and people are killed? Of course they do. They already have it. They already have how they're going to handle that. Secondly, you've got to be honest. You got to come out, as Ivy Lee said, and said, don't try and cover it up. It's always worse. If you try and cover it up, you got to be honest. And then that sometimes means the third thing, which is apologize and mean it. Don't come out there and say, I'm sorry if people feel that way. That's not authentic, right? We're sorry for what we did. It was a bad decision. Mean it. And then move quickly. You can't let things sit because the public opinion gets outraged. And especially in the age of social media, things go around fast. So you got to get a hold of your impressions very quickly, within seconds really today. And then lastly, you got to communicate with the press and other constituencies. You got to be in communication. They are key leaders, right? They're key influencers in how they report stories. Newspapers, social media, television stations, radio stations, the internet in general. Your social media manager has got to be on top of all those social media accounts. But then we also have stockholders, or stakeholders as they are sometimes called. And then there's government regulators. And we go to fracking, there's a lot of regulation that has to do with anything having to do with touching the environment, government regulators. And then finally, you got the good old customers when it comes to businesses, right? You got to stay on top of how your customers are feeling. Otherwise, you go out of business. Now let's talk about when PR went online. That was a huge shift for PR. PR went online in the 1980s and 1990s, and it really presented a new information channel for PR and also a way to gather information from your constituencies, from your publics. Because now, because of online media, and it was very primitive when it came out, as we know from this class, you can go around. You can go around those traditional media companies to try and get the public. You don't need a television press conference. You don't need a radio reporter to get interested in. You don't need to take it a quasi-advertisement or newspaper. Now you can use, and in social media, obviously, to get to people right to there. And you can use your own website to gather more information as well, right? Your website is providing information, but it's also collecting information. And so you have a lot of tools at your disposal if you're in public relations in this online age, and including going viral, which is not always what you want. McDonald's has lots of things go wrong with its sandwiches going viral. You don't want to go viral, that's for sure. Now let's ask some bigger questions about PR and society. We're going to really focus on journalism here and the relationship between the two and how they affect society, because people do look to journalism to make more of the serious decisions in life. I'd like to mention the sociologists David Alteid and Robert Snow here, and they say that most events are covered by, most PR events, let me start again, most news events that are covered by news media start out as PR efforts. Most news events, what you see in the news on TV, starts out as a PR effort, and so 40 to 90% is what they estimate of all news starts out as PR. That means there's a lot of company news in there, right? If a company develops a new product, they put out a press release that sounds really cool, like an iPhone that's completely waterproof and oven-proof and drop-proof, and you don't need a case. That would be a big release, right? And Apple may send out a press release, and you find it in a news story. Now let's go into PR and the government. We've talked a little bit about how the government initiated a huge new phase, but really all elected federal officials, they have a press secretary. So they have permanent staff members who are, that's their job, to get out positive information. Think about that, positive information about that senator or their party or their elective office in general. And there are also, therefore, millions, or thousands, I should say, of lobbyists. These are people who are hired to go in and influence votes, to act on the behalf of companies and organizations and other governments to try and convince elected officials to take votes. Now let's talk about PR and political activism, because PR can be a tool of social change. We would not have, for example, changes in marijuana laws. We would not have changes in gay marriage, as mentioned earlier in the class in other contexts, if we did not have public relations which successfully persuaded the public that these were beneficial to adopt. And so PR and political activism, including the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, and whatever movement may come next as influenced by social media, can make some positive changes. And specifically in the area of the Black Lives Matter movement that took place, I'd like to focus in the end of class now on PR and the civil rights movement. PR and the civil rights movement. I just read a beautiful master's thesis written by a student who's graduating with an MA in our department. You know, we have an MA in communication, right? And she wrote it on the loss of intimacy because of the diminishment of handwritten letters, that people don't handwrite letters anymore. And there's an intimacy that's being lost with that mode of communication. That's a whole other subject. But what I want to mention is she did look at Martin Luther King's jailhouse letter from Alabama. And the jailhouse letter became part of his PR campaign. And I have to wonder, did it indicate an intimacy? If you know a person's in jail and then you see what they're writing about, you're being led into their life, right? Into a side of life that's kind of tough to take a look at. That was a very successful campaign. It also included peaceful protests, press conferences, and leaflets in front of reporters. What were they protesting? Yeah, they were protesting that African Americans did not have equal civil rights. You want to use a water fountain, you got to go to a black-only fountain. Remember the black-only jukeboxes? Same thing. You're a black person, want to ride on the bus? In the back. So that's the way that things were in Alabama. Martin Luther King was successful in turning some of these things around by getting arrested, going to jail, writing letters from jail, getting them published in the newspaper, and then including children in the protests. And that provided riveting images to his public relations campaign. Notice the phrasing I'm using there. public relations campaign. And he was successful. He got rid of some of the colored signs, COLORED, to refer to African Americans. Got them removed from restrooms and drinking fountains, and African Americans were allowed, I can't even believe I'm using that term, allowed to sit at lunch counters and ride buses again. So public relations can be a force for good if it has an ethical background. I hope you have a great day.